I still remember the exact moment the door clicked behind me as the CEO stepped inside the boardroom with that satisfied look on his face. It was my first official day after the company had secured the biggest contract in its history, a contract built entirely on the technology one had spent years developing. That morning, I had walked into the building with a sense of readiness, believing I would finally be given the space to shape the future I had been quietly building toward. But before I could even take off my coat, two security guards approached my desk with a rehearsed calmness that betrayed their discomfort. One of them placed an envelope on the table, while the other waited by the elevator as if I were some kind of threat. I opened the envelope slowly, reading a termination letter that claimed restructuring, misalignment, and strategic redirection. Nothing in the letter reflected reality. It was fiction printed on expensive paper, and everyone knew it. I glanced around the open office. People tried to look busy, though several pairs of eyes flickered toward me with a mix of sympathy and relief. Some whispered behind screens. Others pretended not to notice. I recognized that distance. It is the kind of silence people adopt when they think someone has already lost. I closed the envelope, placed it back on the desk, and nodded at the guards. They walked beside me as if guiding a defeated man toward the exit, but inside I felt none of the heaviness they expected. I felt something sharper, quieter, and far more dangerous. The lobby lights reflected off the glass walls as I stepped outside, and even the receptionist avoided eye contact, as if any small gesture of kindness might pull her into something she did not want to be involved in. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cold air. The building behind me buzzed with the energy of people who believed they had witnessed the end of my story. They did not know that they had only witnessed the beginning. I pulled out my phone, checked a long list of emails sent months earlier to my private attorney, and felt a calm rise through me like a tide. Every draft, every schematic, every improvement, every single method had been secured legally under my name long before this morning. The company believed they owned brilliance. They did not realize brilliance had already secured itself. Inside the boardroom above me, the CEO began his speech. I could imagine it without hearing a word. He would stand tall, straighten his expensive suit, and smile as he told the board he was taking the company in a bold new direction. He would brag about the historic contract, calling it the product of vision and leadership. He would claim the innovation was the fruit of collective effort. And then he would offer a small pause, the kind used by men who think they have mastered theatrics, before announcing that I was no longer part of the team. He would describe it as a necessary change, a strategic decision that would benefit everyone. Some members of the board would nod. Others would pretend to understand. A few would look at their hands, knowing something fell off, but unable to identify it. What none of them knew was that his speech was anchored to a lie so fragile that a single legal document could shatter the entire performance. I had spent years watching that man claim credit for ideas he did not fully understand. I had watched him decorate his career with words like innovation and disruption. He had built a public image on foundations he did not control. And he believed he had finally removed the one person who could reveal the truth. He believed the company could move forward without me. He believed I would panic, break down, or disappear quietly. Everything about that morning revealed how little he understood me. I walked away from the building, not with bitterness, but with calculation. The street was busy, cars honking, people rushing, the world completely unaware that a storm was already forming behind those glass walls. I reached the corner cafe, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window where I could still see the building. I knew the next few hours would unfold exactly as I had predicted. I imagined the CEO raising a glass of sparkling water after the meeting, congratulating himself for handling what he believed was a threat. I imagined managers exchanging relieved smiles as they convinced themselves that they could now claim a share of the spotlight. I imagined HR preparing a script to justify my removal while rehearsing answers to questions they hoped would never come. I took out my laptop and opened a folder that held the true story of the company's success. Hundreds of documents, approved and stamped. Dozens of filings. My signature in every corner that mattered. The systems they depended on. The architecture behind their top product. The algorithm powering the new contract. The patents that protected everything were tied, not to the corporation, but to the small personal entity I had created long before joining them. I had watched the CEO dismiss my contributions publicly while privately relying on my ideas. I had watched the board assume innovation belonged to the company simply because it passed through its doors. This morning they discovered the limits of their assumptions. The longer I sat in that cafe, the clearer the sequence became. My firing was the spark. Their reaction would be the fuel, and my legal ownership of the work would be the fire they could not contain. I felt no rush, no anger, no sense of urgency. I watched people walk past the window and wondered how many of them had been dismissed by someone who underestimated them. How many had swallowed injustice quietly because they lacked the tools to fight back. I wanted them to understand something through my story. Revenge does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives in the silence of preparation. My phone buzzed. A notification appeared confirming that the legal team had received my message. Everything was in motion. I closed my laptop slowly, savoring the stillness of that moment. It was the calm before consequences. Above me, in those glass offices, the CEO believed he had won. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was already beginning to crack. The day they fired me was the day they set the stage for their own downfall. They just did not know it yet. Months before the morning I was escorted out of the building, the story had already begun unfolding in ways no one inside the company suspected. It started quietly, almost invisibly, in the small details that never attract attention. People underestimate the power of silence. They think the only battles worth noticing are loud. But the most decisive victories are prepared in rooms where no one is watching, built from things so ordinary that executives dismiss them as routine. My preparation began long before any of them realized I was preparing for anything at all. When I first joined the company, I paid attention to everything. I watched how managers spoke in meetings. I observed how credit traveled upward and blame traveled downward. I noticed how project updates were often framed to make certain leaders appear more competent than they were. I noticed how the CEO used enthusiasm to conceal a shallow understanding of technology. He could repeat buzzwords fluently, but could never answer a question that required real insight. At first, I thought it was harmless ego. Later, I realized it was part of a deeper pattern. The senior leadership believed that ideas belonged to the person with the highest salary, not the person who did the work. I kept my head down. When they asked for prototypes, I delivered them. When they wanted early drafts of concepts that could potentially transform the company, I created them. When they assigned me impossible deadlines, I met them without complaint. They looked at my silence and interpreted it as weakness. They assumed I was the type who preferred to stay hidden behind spreadsheets rather than step into the spotlight. They were wrong in the way people are wrong when they confuse humility with powerlessness. Every email I wrote was backed up. Every draft was saved in triplicate. Every version of every design carried metadata that identified precisely who created it and when. I kept timestamps, recorded meetings when legally permitted, and created digital backups on an encrypted private server. All of this was done quietly. No performance, no drama. I understood the culture I had walked into. People were rewarded for noise, not substance. I chose substance every time. The more I built, the more ambitious the projects became. My work began forming the backbone of the company's new direction, even though no one acknowledged it publicly. In meetings, managers took turns presenting my discoveries as if they had spent months brainstorming them. The CEO would listen and nod, tapping his pen as if calculating where to place himself in the narrative. After each meeting, he would say words like promising or groundbreaking, but not once did he say my name. At first, I swallowed the irritation. Recognition did not matter to me. Control did. I knew that if the company depended on my ideas, they would eventually depend on me. But dependence in a corporation is fragile. One shift in politics, one ambitious executive, one power struggle, and the person they depend on becomes the person they remove. I knew that if the company ever decided I was expendable, they would not hesitate. That realization shaped the strategy that would later turn their entire leadership upside down. One evening, after a particularly absurd meeting where my department head presented my entire research proposal without even glancing in my direction, I made a decision. I sat at my desk long after everyone had left and outlined a plan that would protect my work even if the company tried to erase my presence. This plan was not about revenge. It was about preservation. I created a personal LLC with a neutral name that raised no suspicion. Then I began the process of filing separate patents for every piece of technology one had created for the company. Each patent was written with care. Each description was exact, covering methods, systems, algorithms, and structures. These were not rushed applications. They were detailed, meticulous, and legally airtight. I consulted with lawyers who specialized in intellectual property. Every conversation was confidential. Every document was routed through channels that never touched the company's systems. The attorneys I worked with never knew which corporation I was employed by. They only knew that a client was securing ownership of original work. I made sure every filing occurred before any official company submission could be made. I checked databases weekly to ensure no one tried to register something that resembled my work. The company assumed I had signed broad intellectual property agreements, but they never realized those agreements were limited to projects formally commissioned and reviewed through specific channels. Most of my work had never passed through those channels. Management wanted results quickly, so they often asked for drafts informally or requested prototypes outside regular documentation. They thought skipping procedure made them efficient. They did not realize it made me the legal owner. I continued producing exceptional work while keeping my distance from the internal politics. People began to overlook me entirely. They talked freely around me, assuming I lacked ambition. That illusion gave me access to conversations that revealed everything. I heard the CEO say he wanted to restructure. I heard managers joke that once the new contract was secured, they no longer needed the original development team. I heard discussions about replacing me with someone cheaper once the heavy lifting was done. They laughed as they said it. They believed brilliance was replaceable. This was when I realized the company had already begun planning my removal long before they handed me that envelope. Their confidence was astonishing. Their lack of foresight was predictable. They saw the finish line of the contract as a trophy. I saw it as the trigger for everything I had prepared. Every new draft I created in those months carried more significance than they understood. Every updated prototype represented one more layer of protection. Every email with technical details was saved not for credit but for evidence. I avoided confrontations. I did not challenge their arrogance. I did not correct the CEO when he misrepresented my work to investors. I did not interrupt when a manager claimed to have developed an algorithm I had written at 3 in the morning. Fighting for recognition inside that environment would have been a waste of energy. I was building something larger than an argument. I was building a silent wall of proof that would stand even if they tried to bury my contributions. By late summer, the technology was complete. The company celebrated as if they had crossed the threshold of a new era. They held private dinners, invited influencers, and wrote drafts for press releases. Not once did they mention my name. That omission no longer bothered me. It confirmed that my plan was necessary. The more invisible they made me, the more powerful my documentation became. Every patent approval email arrived quietly. I never celebrated them publicly. I stored them, organized them, and ensured the dates aligned perfectly. The patent numbers formed a trail of truth that no executive could rewrite. I knew the day would come when that trail would be the only thing standing between my work and their greed. When the contract was finally signed, the board congratulated the CEO as if he had invented the future himself. He basked in the applause, fully unaware that the future he believed he controlled already belonged to someone else. The silent paper trail was complete. They thought they had built an empire on innovation. They never realized the foundation belonged to me. The CEO's plan to remove me did not begin on the morning I was escorted out. It began months earlier, long before the board celebrated the government contract, long before the company believed it had entered a new era. The plan unfolded quietly beneath the surface, built on fake warmth, staged encouragement, and a level of manipulation that only becomes visible when you look back and connect the small details. At the time, I did not know how deliberately the rope was being tightened around me. I only sensed something cold lurking behind every smile he offered. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes, the kind meant to distract rather than reassure. That smile was the first warning sign. It started with a series of meetings that seemed ordinary at first. The CEO began inviting me to discussions that felt strategically vague. He would ask me to present my technology, but encouraged me not to prepare slides or documents. He claimed he preferred spontaneous conversations. I later realized he wanted to keep the details verbal to minimize any trace of my contribution. He would sit across from me at the long conference table, nod politely as I explained the architecture, then turn to the board members with a casual tone, as if translating my work into something he had thought of first. Each time he did it, he wrapped my ideas in his own narrative, shaping them into a vision he pretended to have nurtured from the beginning. There were days when he exaggerated his gratitude. He would clasp my shoulder and tell me the company was lucky to have someone like me. He would flatter my ability to solve impossible problems. But even in those moments, his eyes revealed something colder. It was the look of a man assessing value, not appreciating contribution. He was studying me, measuring how much he could take, and calculating when he could afford to discard the person supplying the innovation he so desperately wanted to claim. The turning point came during a meeting with a delegation from the government agency we were courting. I had prepared a demonstration of the system's key capabilities. It was a decisive moment for the project, the kind that could either secure or destroy a contract. When the meeting began, the CEO unexpectedly interrupted me. He insisted on presenting instead. He spoke with polished confidence, using the exact phrases I had written in the proposal. He described every technical element in simplified terms, the kind that made the board believe he understood more than he did. When the agency representatives asked deeper questions, he faltered. His responses drifted into vague promises, and he glanced at me each time he ran out of words. I stepped in to prevent the meeting from collapsing, providing clear answers that regained the trust of the delegation. They left impressed, promising a follow-up call. Everyone in the room celebrated, but I saw something in the CEO's expression when the door closed. He had wanted the spotlight, but circumstances forced him to share it with me. That irritated him. He hid it behind applause and compliments, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. I did not understand the full extent of that moment until later. After that meeting, the compliments vanished, replaced by sudden criticisms. My reports were questioned. My deadlines were scrutinized. HR requested unexpected check-ins with me to discuss communication style and team fit. The CEO claimed he wanted to build a more collaborative environment, yet every new policy seemed designed to limit my direct involvement in major discussions. Meetings that once required my presence were suddenly held without me. Decisions involving my technology were made silently behind closed doors. One afternoon, during an internal review session, the CEO introduced a new technical advisor, an external consultant he described as an expert who would help accelerate the project. The consultant had no experience with systems like mine. He asked basic questions, the kind that revealed he barely understood the fundamentals. Yet the CEO praised him, placed him at the head of discussions, and encouraged him to take over responsibilities that belonged to me. It was a subtle demotion without a title change, a quiet displacement cloaked in the language of organizational improvement. While this was happening, HR began sending me messages requesting updates on tasks that I had never been assigned. When I clarified the confusion, they responded with canned phrases about performance alignment and process transparency. I recognized it for what it was. They were building a folder. HR never acts out of curiosity. They act on instruction. Someone was preparing a narrative, and that someone was the CEO. The contract negotiations intensified. The government delegation demanded clarity, precision, and full access to the system's architecture. They had questions that only I could answer. The CEO knew this. He needed me long enough to push the contract across the finish line. But once he had what he wanted, I could see the pattern forming. The compliments had stopped. The invitations to meetings had lessened. The consulting advisor had taken center stage. HR had become strangely interested in minor issues that had never mattered before. The CEO continued pretending everything was fine. He greeted me in hallways with the same empty smile. He spoke about trust and collaboration while simultaneously laying the groundwork to remove me. He praised publicly but undermined privately. It was a form of betrayal that adults over 35 recognize instantly because life teaches you to see the difference between sincerity and strategy. Older audiences know this feeling well. It is the moment when you understand someone is preparing to replace you but still relies on the work you produce. As the signing date approached, the CEO increased the pressure. He scheduled meetings without informing me, then questioned why I had not attended. He moved deadlines forward by days without acknowledging the change. He asked for updates on projects that did not exist. When I responded calmly, he acted disappointed. When I asked for clarification, he dismissed the question as a communication failure. It was psychological erosion disguised as leadership. The final meeting before the signing confirmed everything. The CEO gathered the board and the department heads. He stood at the front of the room with a rehearsed speech. He claimed the company was entering a new era. He spoke confidently about technological breakthroughs and strategic alignment. He praised the consulting advisor for accelerating progress. My name was not mentioned once. I sat at the edge of the table and listened as the story of the technology one had created was rewritten in front of me. After the contract was signed, he finally had what he wanted: the recognition, the validation, the applause, the photographs, and the illusion that he had built everything. The next morning, the trap closed. HR summoned me with a neutral tone that carried a hint of urgency. The CEO waited inside the room with the same cold smile he had worn for months. He thanked me for my contribution and announced that the company was restructuring. My role was no longer aligned with the company's future direction. He claimed it was not personal. It was strategic. He did not know that the true strategy had never belonged to him. The rope he tightened around me was about to snap back in a way he never expected. The company did not feel the impact immediately after my firing. For the first few days, they were too busy congratulating themselves. Executives strutted through the halls as if they had engineered a masterstroke. The CEO held informal gatherings in glass offices, telling managers that the company was finally free to move forward without distractions. HR archived my file with the smug confidence of people who believe a problem has been permanently buried. The consultant who had replaced me began giving presentations filled with vague technical jargon that impressed people who did not know enough to question it. Across the building, screens flashed optimistic projections for the upcoming product launch. The contract was secured, and the CEO felt untouchable. But arrogance has an expiration date, and theirs arrived quietly on a Monday morning when the receptionist signed for a thick envelope addressed to the legal department. The package bore the stamp of the law firm that had handled my patents. There was no hostile message, no emotional demand, no threats. Only a precise and professional notification outlining the first of many violations. The letter stated that the company no longer had the right to use or distribute any version of the technology embedded within the product they were preparing to launch. It detailed the patents I legally owned, each number listed with dates and descriptions. It cited the exact sections of intellectual property law that prohibited continued development without my explicit authorization. When the legal department read the letter, they froze. One of the attorneys immediately sent a request for clarification to the CEO, attaching the document with a short message. The CEO skimmed it, dismissed its seriousness, and told them to draft a response. He assumed it was a misunderstanding. He believed he could intimidate me or negotiate privately. He did not know that the letter he was holding was only the first layer of a much larger structure. 2 days later, a second notice arrived. This one was more detailed, outlining how each component of a system was protected by patents filed months before I ever showed the prototypes to management. It included an injunction request, signed by a judge who had reviewed the filings and agreed the case merited immediate attention. The injunction demanded a halt to the production line. The company could not assemble, test, or distribute anything that relied on the protected design. This was not a warning. It was an order. The CEO's confidence began to crack. He called an emergency meeting with the legal department and demanded an explanation. They reviewed the filings publicly, displaying the patent documents on a large screen. Each page bore my name or the name of my LLC. Each document included the dates, signatures, and legal stamps they had ignored during the months they tried to erase my contributions. As the CEO flipped through the pages, his face tightened. His voice, usually loud and theatrical, softened as he tried to understand how everything had slipped away from him without him noticing. One of the attorneys explained the situation calmly. The patents were legitimate. The filings were legally sound. The company had no claim over the intellectual property because the work had not been submitted through official channels. The CEO had insisted on informality to speed up the process. He had bypassed paperwork to maintain control. He had created the loophole that allowed me to protect everything. The attorney concluded by saying the company had two choices: comply with the injunction or face immediate legal penalties. The CEO dismissed the meeting abruptly and stormed back to his office. But the damage had already begun spreading. Investors noticed delays in communication. Partners reached out to ask why scheduled demonstrations had been canceled. Word traveled quickly in the corporate world. Nothing attracts attention like unexpected silence. At the end of the week, another letter was delivered. This one was the most devastating of all. It was a formal cease and desist order addressed to the company's board and the CEO personally. It stated that any attempt to modify, rebrand, or redeploy the patented system would result in further legal action. It explained that every improvement the company had attempted to create was also covered under the umbrella of my filings. They could not adjust a parameter, rewrite a line of code, or shift a structural component without violating intellectual property law. The technology they had celebrated as the core of their next decade of growth had been legally removed from their hands. The board called an emergency session. Chairs were pulled. Phones vibrated. People spoke in the hushed tone of crisis. For weeks, they had indulged the fantasy that the CEO had masterminded a breakthrough. Now, they sat in a circle under the fluorescent lights of the conference room, listening to the legal department explain how deeply they were exposed. The CEO tried to defend himself. He insisted it was a misunderstanding. He claimed I was bitter about being let go. He blamed the legal team for not catching the filings earlier. He blamed HR for not securing stricter intellectual property agreements. He even suggested that the patents were invalid because the work had been completed while I was employed there. But the attorneys shook their heads. The negligence belonged to him alone. As the crisis deepened, the tone inside the building shifted. The optimism that filled the hallways dissolved into anxiety. Executives who had once bragged about the upcoming launch now avoided eye contact with each other. Managers whispered behind closed doors. The consultant who had replaced me began distancing himself from the project, insisting he had only been hired to assist. The government contract that had once seemed to guarantee stability was now in jeopardy. Representatives from the agency demanded clarification. Investors requested urgent meetings. The media caught wind of the delays and began asking questions about internal conflicts. The CEO, desperate to contain the situation, sent me a message through a private email account. He framed the situation as a misunderstanding and suggested a friendly conversation. He attempted to appear reasonable. He invoked the past months of collaboration as if they had been moments of mutual respect. He even tried to flatter my intelligence, claiming the company still valued my contributions. But his tone revealed fear. He was no longer speaking as a leader. He was speaking as a man who realized the ground under him was dissolving. I did not respond. The silence was deliberate. Silence, when used properly, becomes a statement more powerful than any threat. The following week, the board issued a public notice delaying the product launch indefinitely. They tried to disguise the reason with phrases about preparation, review, and optimization. Investors were not fooled. Shares dipped, then dipped again. Rumors began spreading about internal disputes, leadership failures, and legal complications. The narrative shifted completely. The CEO was no longer the visionary behind the breakthrough. He was the negligent executive who jeopardized the company's future by firing the one person who understood the technology. As the investors demanded answers, the CEO faced the consequences of his own decisions. His emails to the board grew increasingly frantic. His explanations became inconsistent. His allies distanced themselves. His reputation, once polished and admired, began cracking under the weight of his arrogance. The letters had not arrived with drama. They had arrived with precision, patience, and absolute certainty. And with each one, the power they believed they held slipped back toward me. The day the letters arrived was the day the balance shifted. The empire they believed they controlled began crumbling not with noise, but with paper. The board had weathered storms before. Market crashes, failed products, scandals that required swift public statements. They had always believed that with enough strategy and enough money, any problem could be managed. But nothing prepared them for the crisis that unfolded in the days following the avalanche of legal letters. This was not a temporary setback or a miscommunication that could be smoothed over with polished language. This was a structural collapse, one that reached into the foundation of everything the company had built over the past 2 years. The first emergency meeting took place on a Thursday morning, long before sunrise, because no one could sleep. Every board member arrived with a folder in hand and a troubled expression that revealed how deeply the situation unnerved them. The room felt colder than usual. Perhaps it was the tension, or perhaps it was the immediate recognition that they were about to confront more than a legal inconvenience. The general counsel placed several patent documents on the center of the table. Each one displayed the same signature. Mine. The board members leaned forward, flipping pages, reading dates, examining technical descriptions written with a clarity they now realized none of the executives could replicate. The patents were not vague or incomplete. They were the type of filings created by someone who understood the technology down to its smallest components. For the first time, the board understood the magnitude of what had been taken from them by the CEO's reckless decisions. One board member, a former engineer who had risen through the ranks decades earlier, removed his glasses and stared at the pile of documents in silence. He understood technology well enough to recognize that every single component of their planned launch, from the algorithm to the infrastructure, was built on the intellectual property protected in those filings. He asked the general counsel a simple question: how much of the upcoming product relies on these patents? The answer was immediate. All of it. The room remained quiet for a long moment. The weight of the truth sank slowly, like ice melting in water. They had believed the CEO when he claimed the company had full rights because the work had been created in-house. They assumed he had ensured all the necessary documents were signed. They trusted him to oversee the legal foundation of the company's most valuable innovation. They never imagined that the CEO had skipped crucial steps to secure personal glory. They now realized his ambition had blindsided him. He had been so desperate to take credit that he ignored every legal safeguard that should have been enforced. The general counsel continued the explanation with a level of calm that made the situation even more severe. Internal audits had revealed an alarming pattern. The CEO had repeatedly pushed for shortcuts, encouraging verbal approvals instead of formal documentation. He had insisted on rapid development cycles that bypassed standard protocol. He had neglected to involve the legal team in the early stages, claiming it would slow down creativity. The board learned that while they believed progress was being made efficiently, what was really happening was a systematic erosion of their legal standing. Another board member, one known for his sharp business acumen and blunt honesty, leaned back in his chair and asked the question on everyone's mind. Did the CEO ever verify that the intellectual property belonged to the company? The attorney responded with a single word. No. That word hit the board like a blow. It was not said harshly. It was said with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for argument. The CEO had acted entirely on assumption. He believed that employment automatically transferred ownership. He believed signatures were a formality. He believed he could fire the creator of the technology without consequence. The board was not angry in that moment. Anger would have been almost comforting. Instead, they felt something far more dangerous. They felt clarity. Clarity that the man they had trusted with the direction of the company had not only failed them, but exposed them to catastrophic legal risk. The collapse they were witnessing was not caused by external pressure. It was caused by internal negligence. It was caused by the CEO's obsession with recognition. It was caused by months of decisions made without oversight. As the meeting continued, the head of finance presented data that deepened the gravity of the situation. The projected revenue for the next 8 years was based entirely on the government contract and the products built from the patented system. Without access to the technology, the company would lose not only the contract, but its competitive edge and market positioning. Investors who had spoken with excitement about the breakthrough would now question whether the company had any authentic innovation to offer. Stock value, brand confidence, and partnership opportunities were all at risk. The consultant hired to replace me was asked to explain the development process. His response exposed more layers of incompetence. He admitted he had never reviewed the patents. He assumed ownership belonged to the company. He confessed he had trusted the CEO's assurances without question. His voice shook slightly as he spoke, not out of guilt, but out of fear. He understood that his role in the deception, even if unintentional, placed him in a position of responsibility he was never qualified to handle. The board chairwoman finally spoke. She had been silent for most of the meeting, absorbing every detail. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough corporate disasters to recognize when a leader had become a liability. She asked the attorneys what options remained. The answer was grim. The company could negotiate to license the patents, but the cost would be significant. They could attempt to challenge the filings, but the likelihood of success was extremely low. They could attempt to build a new system from scratch, but that would take years and resources they did not have. Each option illuminated the same truth. The company's fate depended entirely on someone they had dismissed. They examined emails pulled from the CEO's account. The audit uncovered messages that revealed he had received warnings about patent risks, but ignored them. Messages where managers asked about documenting the intellectual property, only to be told not to complicate the process. Messages that demonstrated he had treated legal protocol as an inconvenience rather than a protection. The more the board read, the clearer the picture became. The CEO had not simply failed to check the filings. He had actively avoided verification because he assumed his authority made verification unnecessary. The collapse was not dramatic. It was cold, quiet, methodical. The consequences lined up neatly in front of them, like dominoes placed by an invisible hand. The board now understood that the company's most celebrated achievement had been built on unsecured ground. They also understood that I had been the only person who recognized the danger early enough to protect the work. My silence, which they once interpreted as passivity, now appeared as discipline. My departure, which the CEO had celebrated as a victory, now stood as the catalyst for their downfall. The board adjourned the meeting with heavy silence. No one defended the CEO. No one questioned the authenticity of the patents. No one minimized the damage. They walked out of the room with the realization that they were not facing a simple leadership issue. They were facing the consequences of trusting a man who valued recognition over responsibility. And as the crisis unfolded, the truth became impossible to deny. The company had placed its future in the hands of someone who never built anything. The person who built everything had been escorted out with a termination letter. The collapse had begun, and no amount of denial could stop it now. The CEO always believed that downfall was something that happened to other people. He thought consequences were for those who lacked influence, lacked talent, or lacked the ability to control the narrative. For years, he had walked through the building like a man whose position was carved in stone. He dismissed warnings. He ignored protocol. He treated employees as replaceable gears in a machine he believed he alone kept running. But arrogance ages quickly when exposed to light. And the light arrived brutally, silently, and without hesitation. The first crack appeared on the stock ticker early one morning. Investors had sensed something was wrong long before the official announcements. The unexplained delays, the stilted communication, the sudden silence around the upcoming launch. Nothing collapses confidence faster than secrecy. When the injunction became public, analysts began to dig. They found gaps in the company's disclosures. They found inconsistencies in the CEO's previous statements. They found reporters willing to investigate the truth buried behind closed doors. The stock dipped once, then dropped again, then fell so sharply that the board's internal channels lit up with urgent messages. By noon, financial news outlets picked up the story. The company that claimed to be leading the next technological revolution had been served with multiple patent infringement notices. The reports were clinical and devastating. They outlined how the company had built its future on intellectual property it did not own. They revealed that the creator of the technology had been fired days before the scandal erupted. They explained how the CEO had repeatedly failed to verify ownership. They made it clear that the collapse was not caused by external forces, but by internal negligence at the highest level. The CEO watched the news from his office, the blinds half open, the screen reflecting off the polished glass table he once used for celebratory meetings. His jaw tightened as anchors described the situation as unprecedented. He turned off the television, but the silence that followed was worse. Silence does not hide the truth. It amplifies it. Throughout the building, employees whispered in corridors. People who had once avoided discussing leadership now spoke freely. They remembered the times the CEO dismissed concerns. They remembered how often he minimized people's contributions. They remembered the days he had taken credit for work he barely understood. Word spread quickly. Conversations grew bolder. And in offices once filled with ambition, disappointment settled like dust. HR felt the shift first. Employees began reaching out with stories they had kept to themselves for years. Stories about meetings where the CEO belittled staff. Stories about promotions denied without explanation. Stories about ideas stolen and presented as his own. Stories about emails sent late at night with unreasonable demands. These stories, once whispered behind locked doors, began to circulate officially. HR employees who had felt powerless now saw an opportunity to speak. They had watched him intimidate people. They had seen him silence complaints. They had been ordered to bury incidents that should have been investigated. Now they opened the folder. Details leak one by one. Anonymous accounts appeared online describing the culture inside the company. Former employees shared their experiences with a sense of relief. They were no longer afraid. The CEO's shield of authority cracked, and through that crack poured every truth he had hidden. Partners withdrew next. A major supplier sent a formal notice suspending collaboration until further clarification was provided. Another partner, who had previously praised the company publicly, released a statement expressing deep concern. They emphasized the need for ethical leadership and legal transparency. Sponsors pulled out of upcoming events. Invitations that had once filled the CEO's calendar were quietly revoked. The glamorous facade he had built around himself began to dissolve. Inside the boardroom, tension climbed so high it felt like a physical weight. The board had tried to remain neutral, hoping the crisis could be managed. But with every passing hour, the evidence grew stronger. The CEO had not made a single mistake. He had made a series of deliberate decisions rooted in ego, impatience, and disregard for the people who actually built the company's future. And now the consequences had arrived with precision. During an emergency session, the board chairwoman presented a summary of investor feedback. It was organized in cold, structured points. Investors demanded accountability. They wanted leadership changes. They wanted reassurance that negligence would not be tolerated. They wanted the CEO removed. The chairwoman placed the printed reports on the table. No one disagreed. The CEO entered the room moments later. His confident posture was gone. His eyes looked tired in a way that revealed more than exhaustion. He addressed the room with a practiced calm, insisting that the situation was recoverable. He blamed miscommunication. He blamed unexpected legal complications. He blamed the pace of innovation. He never blamed himself. Not once did he acknowledge that his decisions had led them here. The board listened, not out of respect, but out of obligation. They allowed him to speak the way one allows a man to finish a sentence that will not change the outcome. When he finished, the room remained silent. Then the head of finance spoke. His voice was steady and direct. He outlined the financial losses already incurred. He explained the projected decline if leadership did not change immediately. He stated that the company could not move forward without addressing the root cause of the crisis. The CEO tried to interrupt, but the board chairwoman raised a hand gently, signaling him to stop. Next came the head of legal. She explained the legal exposure caused by the CEO's negligence. She revealed emails he had ignored. She described protocol violations. She stated that the company could not defend itself from the legal claims as long as the CEO remained in power. Her tone was calm, professional, and devastating. Then the board chairwoman asked the only question that mattered. Should the CEO remain in his position? The vote was not dramatic. It was precise. Hands raised. Voices counted. The outcome was unanimous. The CEO was removed. He did not shout. He did not argue. He sat quietly, stunned, as if the gravity of his downfall had not reached him yet. He had spent years believing he could control every narrative. But power built on arrogance cannot withstand truth. Truth arrives without fear, without applause, and without hesitation. Security did not escort him through the building. That would have been a spectacle. Instead, he was told to gather his personal belongings after hours. His name would be removed from the internal directory by morning. His office access would be revoked. His parking spot reassigned. The downfall of the CEO was not loud. It was clean, silent, unstoppable. It was the kind of justice that speaks to adults who have lived long enough to know that arrogance always collapses under its own weight. And as he walked out of the boardroom for the last time, everything he had tried to claim slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but the consequences he had created. The email arrived early on a Tuesday morning, the kind of hour when most people were still deciding whether to get out of bed or linger a little longer under the weight of their routines. The sender's name alone was enough to make me pause. It was not the head of legal, not a manager, not an assistant. It was the board chairwoman herself, a woman known for her strategic calm and her ability to dismantle egos with a single sentence. Her message was brief, professional, and unmistakably urgent. She asked for a private meeting at a confidential location. There was no explanation, no agenda, only an invitation and a tone that revealed something important. They were not reaching out in authority. They were reaching out in need. I read the email twice, then closed my laptop without replying. My coffee sat untouched. My apartment felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves waited for my decision. Weeks had passed since the letters had gone out, and in that time, I had watched the company twist under the pressure of consequences they created for themselves. I had watched the CEO fall. I had watched the board scramble for stability. I had watched investors panic. Now, they wanted to meet with the person they had once discarded without hesitation. I could almost hear the irony breathing in the air around me. They answered without defensiveness. They accepted responsibility. They did not try to excuse their ignorance. They did not blame circumstance. They did not attempt flattery. For the first time, they spoke honestly. Their honesty did not erase the past, but it illuminated something important. This was not a company trying to manipulate me. This was a company confronting consequences and recognizing that rebuilding required humility. Still, I did not respond immediately. Power is not something you give away. Power is something you measure carefully before deciding where to place it. I gathered the documents. I thanked them for their time. I told them I needed to think. Their surprise flickered across their faces, but they accepted it. They understood I was no longer the employee who once sat quietly in meetings. I now controlled the direction of everything they wanted to salvage. When I left the room, the hallway felt lighter, almost hollow, as if the building itself understood the shift. The board had offered me more power than the CEO ever held, but power is not simply accepted. It is chosen with intention. As I walked toward the elevator, the tension did not fade. It deepened. The decision ahead was not about money or position. It was about memory, about dignity, about whether I wanted to rebuild the empire that once tried to destroy me. For the first time, the future was entirely in my hands, and I intended to choose carefully. The morning I finally made my decision was colder than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the light filtering through my window looked muted, almost hesitant, as if it understood the weight of the choice I was about to make. I sat at my desk with the documents spread in front of me, reading each page slowly, not because I needed clarification, but because I wanted to feel the full meaning of what lay before me. I was not the man who had once walked into that company hoping to be valued. I was not the employee who had kept his head down while others claimed his work. I was not the silent observer of injustice. I was someone who had witnessed the collapse of arrogance, endured the sting of betrayal, and built a wall of preparation strong enough to outlast every attempt to erase him. And now, after everything, the choice was mine alone. The board's proposal was fair in numbers but desperate in tone. They needed access to the patents. They needed licensing rights. They needed stability to convince investors they could recover from the chaos the former CEO had created. The figure they offered would secure my future. It would allow me to build without fear, without limits, without depending on the unpredictable whims of corporate politics. But this decision was not about money alone. It was about reclaiming something far more important: time, respect, autonomy, dignity. I thought about the CEO, the man who once believed he held the power to silence me. His downfall had already begun the moment the patent surfaced. He was officially removed, stripped of his title, and left to confront the consequences of his ambition. But revenge was not watching him fall. Revenge was simply living my life without carrying the shadow of what he had done. I realized then that true power is not exercised in the noise of confrontation or the thrill of victory. It is exercised in the quiet confidence of someone who knows he has already won. When I arrived at the board's office for the final meeting, the atmosphere felt different from previous encounters. The board members stood as I entered, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The chairwoman invited me to sit, and this time, her tone carried no hidden agenda. She asked if I was ready to move forward. I nodded and placed the signed agreement on the table. There was a moment of silence as they read the document. The terms were clear. The patents would be sold at a price that reflected their true value, not the undervalued number the CEO had once believed he could force upon me. The company would receive the rights they needed to survive. I would receive the resources and freedom necessary to create something of my own. The future would separate us permanently, each of us moving in directions that revealed who we truly were. The board members exhaled as if a physical weight had lifted. The chairwoman extended her hand with a gratitude that could not be faked. She said the company would not forget what I had done. She said they hoped the agreement marked a beginning rather than an end. I understood her intention, but the truth was simpler. For me, this was the closing chapter. There was nothing left to rebuild with them. The story between us had reached its natural conclusion. I exited the conference room calmly. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no lingering resentment, no need for final speeches. The storm had passed, leaving a clarity no anger could ever provide. As I walked into the sunlight outside, something shifted within me. The space that had once held disappointment now held possibility. The weight of betrayal had evaporated, replaced by a steady certainty that I had reclaimed my path. Within weeks, the funds transferred. The company issued its public statement about leadership transitions and intellectual property acquisitions. Employees whispered about the quiet man whose departure had triggered a corporate earthquake. The former CEO tried to blame the board. Then he tried to blame the legal team. Then he tried to blame the culture. But no story he told could hide the truth. His downfall was written in his own choices. Every step he took to erase me had moved him closer to erasing himself. Meanwhile, I began building something new. Not loudly, not impulsively, not out of bitterness, out of intention, out of maturity, out of a desire to create a place where ideas were respected, where innovation was nurtured, where talent was not suffocated by ego. I rented a small office, hired a team of people who believed in the technology, and shaped a vision unburdened by the noise of corporate politics. I worked with the same discipline I had always had, but now with a freedom that transformed every day into progress rather than survival. The company that once fired me rebuilt itself slowly, but it would never regain the arrogance it once held. The board replaced its leadership. Investors watched cautiously. The new CEO acknowledged the patents publicly, something the previous one would never have done. They survived, but the power dynamic had shifted permanently. They would always remember the day they discovered the man they underestimated had been the foundation of everything they valued. I often reflect on the journey, not with triumph, but with perspective. People imagine revenge as a dramatic act, a confrontation, a moment of triumph over an enemy. But revenge, real revenge, is much quieter. It is the ability to walk away from what harmed you without carrying the burden of anger. It is reclaiming your time after someone tried to steal it. It is choosing progress over resentment, creation over destruction, future over past. For anyone over 35, the lesson becomes painfully clear. Life teaches you that battles are not won through noise or emotion. They are won through preparation, through patience, through confidence in your own path, even when others try to push you off it. Power does not come from shouting. Power comes from the documents you secure, the decisions you make slowly, the resilience you build quietly. When people try to erase you, the greatest revenge is not proving them wrong. It is outlasting them. It is thriving long after they have forgotten their cruelty. It is becoming someone they can neither control nor define. And that is what I did. I walked away without anger. I built a life they could not diminish. I reclaimed my time. Because power is not noise. Power is paper. Power is preparation. Power is patience.